Good morning, Digit fam, and if you read my tweet last night, the answer is nope, I'm good. And even better news, the First to Find streak remains intact. Shout out to J3 Yoda at the impromptu First to Find party, and a longtime listener Amanda, who was on her way, but unfortunately late to the party. But I digress. It is February 18th, 2019, and this is your Digit Daily. When you consider companies making foldable phones, the first question you naturally ask yourself is what form factor will the company choose? You've got the outside folder, like the Royal Flex Pi. You've got the inside folder, like the Samsung Galaxy whatever letter they're going to call it. You've got the flip phone, like Motorola. Then there's TCL, who's got, well, pretty much all of them. CNet has a write-up showing off renders for 5 potential folding phones and tablets that TCL is working on. Yes, 5. And TCL is leaving no stone unturned, covering all the designs I just mentioned and throwing in a slap bracelet phone. Slap bracelets, for those of you who weren't alive in the 80s, and let's face it, that's probably most of you.
You're old.
Yeah. Anyway, so a slap bracelet was this fabric-covered piece of metal that was straight, but when you slapped it around your wrist, it curled around your arm like a python who doesn't understand the meaning of the word cuddle. And now you see why these things kinda died out. Now, this smartphone / slap bracelet hybrid almost certainly won't work like that. I envision this to be much more like the smartphone bracelet prototype that Lenovo showed off a couple years ago. It's basically like a smartphone that can wrap around your wrist. Now, the only question is, do you want that? Now, personally, I can kind of see the attraction. Smartwatches that don't have an Apple sticker on them are still super niche and not widely adopted, but you can't deny the attraction of a smart device that's small enough to fit on your wrist, but as powerful as a smartphone. But just from a strictly fashion standpoint, I'm not sure I see these taking off. Men don't generally wear bracelets or bangles, and most women don't wear bracelets or bangles big enough to make decent phone screens. I mean, we'll see, but I just don't see it. The other designs look potentially interesting, but generally still kind of tone deaf. It's more like TCL is making these designs because it can, not necessarily because it should. But it is awesome that someone is exploring all these different designs, even if TCL says we won't see a foldable phone until 2020. I just assumed that it would be 5 someones pursuing 5 different designs. For one company to do it, it's pretty bold. Almost as bold as, say, I don't know, bringing back the BlackBerry brand and making smartphones with keyboards. I mean, it's worked so far, and if I had the ability to predict the future, I wouldn't be talking in your ears right now, so let's just assume that I'm the moron in this equation, and TCL knows what it's talking about. You can ask my wife. Assuming I'm the moron is always the safest course of action. So assume we shall while we head into the roundup! And speaking of bold strategies, LG is looking particularly bold by releasing the LG V50 about a day and a half after releasing the LG V40 late last year. The caveat? The LG V50 will earn the 5 in its name by being LG's first 5G phone. This phone looks a lot like the V40, but we've got a 4,000 milliamp hour battery in there, which is a nice upgrade. But this is a 5G phone, which means it'll likely be pricey AF, and it's Sprint, which, well, it's Sprint, so, good luck with that. Android Authority has a short little smartphone quiz, and like Tristan on the newsletter, I too scored 7 out of 10. But I mean, the ones I got wrong, I was like 50-50 with the right answer, so I guess, whatever. Take the quiz yourself and see if you can beat us. Just remember, the Sony Xperia was released at... Yeah, I could tell you, but I won't. And in what may be an unexpected victory for Huawei, it appears the United Kingdom won't completely rule out using Huawei equipment for its telecom infrastructure. The UK's National Cybersecurity Centre feels it can limit the risks associated with using the Chinese manufacturer's gear in their infrastructure, which is interesting. But this is also the same country that collectively Googled "What is Brexit?" the day after they voted for Brexit, so maybe they're not the most credible source for something like this. TechCrunch breaks down the all-too-common and laughable, quote, "We take your privacy and security seriously." Spoiler alert, they don't. They just screwed up and now have to say something now that you're paying attention to them. Data breaches are unfortunately a common fact of life on the internet, and right now the best way to protect yourself is to use two-factor authentication where you can, and use a password manager if you can. But the operative words in that statement are protect yourself. Don't count on other companies to protect your stuff because they suck at it. And the best defense you have is to not suck at it yourself. Have you heard of Vine and HQ Trivia? These days, people are lucky to have one hit associated with their name, let alone two, which makes this story about Colin Kroll that much more tragic. The Wall Street Journal wrote of his success, making him millions of dollars in his 20s, only to have his life cut short by a drug overdose at the age of 34. It's not a completely unusual story, but it's generally reserved for actors or musicians. But that kind of fame for someone who's just not ready for it can hit and destroy anyone. Almost a year ago, the Sound Guys podcast released their debut episode in which they discussed the fascinating history behind the MP3 format. I'll link to that in the show notes because it's a great episode and I produced that podcast as well. But what's equally fascinating is the history of the JPEG image format and the place that Lena Forson holds in digital imaging history. This story from Wired has it all. Fascinating history, controversy, and all sorts of geekery. Give it a read, it's definitely worth your time. And finally, I've given Facebook a bad rap until now, and frankly, it's well earned. But a story from CNN tells us that Facebook is actively looking into ways to prevent the spread of misinformation and lies pertaining to the anti-vax movement. And while I could say it's about time, what I will say is, Facebook, good on ya. But what bugs me about this, and will always bug me about this, is the cries of Facebook impinging on free speech. And while I could go off on a long rant, about what free speech is or isn't, I'm going to let Arthur Kaplan, a professor and founding head of the Division of Medical Ethics at NYU Langone Health, which I may or may not be pronouncing correctly, in New York, say it for me. Quote, "I'm not trying to say that someone can't take positions against vaccines on Facebook," he said. "I know people are going to say this is an intrusion into free speech. Many anti-vaxxers will say that. But no one is saying that you can't be anti-vaccination. What we're saying is you can't lie." And I'll be honest here, I had 2 whole paragraphs written here about morons and Jenny McCarthy, and they're not necessarily 2 separate things, but I'm going to leave those words unspoken because this is only a 7-minute podcast. So, that is going to do it for today's Digit Daily. If you'd like to learn more about any of these stories, check out the links in the show notes and subscribe to our daily newsletter on Digit.com. And if you like what you heard, subscribe and leave a review on your favorite podcast player. Once again, I'm Adam Dowd, Dead Technology on Twitter, and we'll talk again tomorrow.